Alright, so I've gone ahead and got everything sanded down. I got the frame as well as the fork here sanded down, not all the way through the primer, but I think that should be fine. Typically a lot of people just say just remove a lot of the paint, give some scratches for something to adhere to. But anywhere that there was a little more damage that might have gotten through both the paint and the primer, I went ahead and sanded a little more, especially down here where there was a lot of chain whip damage, and then just random little dings on the frame here and there. Now other than that, I got it hung on this sort of like, sort of stand my brother made for a punching bag, but he never really got it to work because it's kind of wobbly. But for this purpose, it should work out pretty well. It's hangable, so I'm going to go ahead and sort of finish up a little more touch-ups, going to sort of plug all the holes that I don't want to get paint on. So any kind of threads, something in the bottom bracket. I think I will leave these unplugged just so a little bit of paint can get in there. And the only reason is that I want to prevent some rust from forming, especially in these holes where it could sort of seize up. So I'm going to leave those unplugged. The seat post especially is starting to get a little bit rusty, so hopefully a little bit of paint in there can sort of protect it. Afterwards, using a little bit of grease on the seat post should make it perfect. Other than that, there's not much to it. We can just get going with the painting. First I'm going to do a little bit of primer. Oh, up here there was that plastic piece, sort of as the emblem on the bike, but I removed it, but now there's two holes. So I went ahead and filled it up with a little bit of Bondo body filler that I had lying around. So once that's dry, I'm going to give it another sand, and then it should disappear when we paint over it. So we're going to go ahead and use just plain spray paint because I'm cheap, and I didn't want to spend the extra couple dollars for automotive body paints, stuff like that. So we'll go ahead and see how that works. If it's a total failure, then oops. But we're just going to go with it, see how it handles. So yeah, again, back on a primer, and then we'll do some paint, and then a clear coat. So yeah, let's go. Alright, so over the past couple days, I went ahead and painted the frame as well as the fork. Now I did a primer, a base coat, and then a top coat. Now, while I was waiting in between for it to dry, we also went ahead and sort of cleaned up different bike parts. We disassembled the wheel, re-greased the bearings, we took apart and sort of cleaned up the derailleurs, the shifters, and then painted a couple smaller items, sort of like the handlebars. So we did a little bit of work while we were waiting for a lot of these big items to dry. Now, before we get too far, I do want to warn you to really test your spray paints before you use them. Now, it seems pretty obvious, but a lot of times spray paints don't like to cooperate with each other and can lead to bubbling. Now, the base coat that I chose to use was this Krystal Color Max Pro, and actually let me get this. And there's actually two different versions. Now, they have these, they look, well, coloring is different, but the brand, the name is basically the same, except you have another X on this one. So this is the original paint that I used, and I basically sprayed it on, realized I didn't have enough, so I went to a Fred Meyer's, but they were sold out, so I picked up this can instead. But the issue is that the crystal clear enamel that I use, which is from Rust-Oleum, now enamel should be able to go on lacquer as well as enamel as long as you give it enough time to dry. The issue was that it seemed to not have an issue with the color max with 1X, but once you painted on the color max with 2X's, it seemed to cause it to bubble. So going from one to the other has a different formula, which does not interact well with the crystal clear enamel. Now, since I already sprayed my entire frame and fork with sort of this different orange color, I went ahead and tried a little more expensive option, but I didn't want to bother with sort of the bubbling and resanding and repainting. So I went ahead and picked up the Universal Clear from Rust-Oleum. Now this stuff works pretty well. I put it on very thick coats. Well, a couple thin and then thicker coats. Try to get everything, especially the little nooks and crannies, nice and sort of coated, because when I do the next step, which is the sanding and polishing, I want to make sure I don't sand through to the base coat, or sand through the base coat either. But that's sort of the next step that we have to go on, and I am pretty hopeful that I don't need to do any more clear coating, but of course, if we do, we can always grab another can. So yeah, let's get on to sanding and polishing. Yikes. Now, that was an awful process. Basically, my paint was not completely cured. I ended up using 2 cans of base coat, and that's 2 cans, not 2 coats, as well as 2 cans of clear coat on top of that over a course of maybe 3 to 4 days. So that's a lot of paint, a lot of layers, and not a lot of time to dry. All in essence, the paint wasn't entirely cured underneath when I started sanding it. So after, like, even though it was nice and hard to the touch on the surface, once you start sanding down below the surface where it's a little harder to cure, it got into some paint that wasn't entirely dry yet. So there wasn't any issues with the actual sanding. Everything sanded well. It came off in milky sort of white color, which is what you want. You don't want any kind of base coat coming off or you've gone too far. But it came off in a nice, easy, and expected way. But all the residue left sort of a nice sort of tacky feeling to your fingers, which is the first hint that things weren't completely cured and dried yet. Typically you want it to be just like dust, because it is supposed to be dust, not little particles of basically glue. So that was the first issue, basically, was that things weren't drying enough. On top of that, when I rinsed the frame off, some of the water caught those particulates and basically dried into some droplets. and then those droplets itself cured, basically adding some weird watermarks onto my bike and my fork. So that wasn't very good. So I ended up actually scrapping just using a 1200. I actually lied. I don't have 1200 grit sandpaper. I have 800 and 2000 grit. So I just ended up using 800, and then I finished it off with a 1200 grit after those weird watermarks came in. So after completely sanding that, I did leave a little more time in between the sanding to sort of give it a little more time to dry, but again, that second time I hit it with the 2000 grit, it still had that weird residue feeling. Not as much as before, but enough. So I ended up leaving it out to dry for another 1.5 days. I put it out in the sun to hopefully speed up the process. Again, it was dry to the touch, but when I started buffing it, I first tried it with the compound. Now, the compound, I took a look at the back, and it actually has petroleum distillates, which is really bad because it basically softened and took off some of the top coat, clear coat that I had on there. So you really want something that's nice and hard when you want to polish it, or else it'll just keep creating the same grooves and won't get a nice shine to it. So having the paint soften from the petroleum distillates was not good. So in the end, I just used a clean sock, just cotton fabric, and polished it up. It leaves a decent shine. It's definitely not as good as it could be, but all things considered, and especially given not wanting to take a couple more days on this project, or a month even, I went ahead and just used the sock. And if I really need it to be super shiny in the future, I can go ahead and dismount everything from the bike and then use the polishing compound and give it another go around. But there are so many unknowns with the polishing compound that I just decided to move ahead with the project. And ahead means, at this point, mounting all of the parts that we have remaining. So we just have to get everything back on the bike, get everything pressed back in, put together, get the wheels on, and then finally wrap the handlebars. And then everything should be good to go and ready for riding. So let's get to it. The sooner the better. So the bike is completely finished, and it's kind of amazing how much a little bit of handlebar tape goes a long way in pulling everything together. Now I got the handlebar tape wrapped, I got it tuned, I took it for a quick ride to make sure the brakes were engaging correctly, and everything works pretty well. It runs really smoothly, especially given the new grease in the wheels and in the bottom bracket, and overall I'm pretty happy. Along the way it just cost me maybe 20 years off my back, but honestly the more important factor here is that it also cost me some money. Now the bike itself was $150. Given the shape it was in, given that I replaced the handlebar wraps, the cable housing, and the brakes itself, I probably could have negotiated down to $100, but it's too late for that. On top of that, the bar tape was around $14. The brakes itself that I got were $22. The kickstand was $9, and then the cable kit was $26. So in total for the hardware on the bike was around $221. On top of that, we did need to buy some oil, which was $9, and then some degreaser for cleaning the chain and other parts, which ended up being $15, bringing up the total to around $245. And then factoring in spray paint at around $5 per can for 5 cans, brings the total up to around $270. Now the one silver lining to this is that these old brake levers are still in decent shape. They're a little scuffed up here and there, but they're still nice, and they still work. So I believe I took a look on eBay, and I might be able to get maybe $15 for them. So a little bit of a return from the brakes. But other than that, the bike is, it's done. It's finally complete, though there were a little bit of cosmetic mishaps here and there. While tuning, I did accidentally give my frame a little bit of chain whip here. On the top, there was a little scratch from when I dropped, I think it was a part of the center pole brakes. And then on the front fork, there's also a nick. Not too sure how it got there, but honestly pretty small and not super noticeable if you don't know where it is. It is a little disappointing, but again, it's what happens when you sort of rush the process and don't really give things the proper time to cure. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it. Hopefully you enjoyed watching me build this bike and learn about biking, because it's honestly pretty fun. And if anyone's interested in it, just dive right in, do as I do, and buy a bike without knowing anything about biking. That's actually an awful idea, but it's what I did. But if you did enjoy this, I don't know why you're watching it. Just leave already. There you go. And hopefully you'll see me do something next time. I'm not too sure what it's going to be, but I don't know, I have my eyes on maybe some kind of woodworking project for organization, but we'll see. But yeah, take care.